Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Rachel Bronson. I'm the Vice President for Programs and Studies at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Happy New Year. Glad to see you. Let me start by asking you, if possible, to turn off your cell phones or noisy devices. And if you can't turn them off, then if you could silence them, we'd really appreciate it. I'd like to just bring your attention to some upcoming programs. On January 25th, we'll be hosting a program with a one-year assessment of President Obama's progress on key foreign policy issues, and we're delighted to have with us leading that conversation David Sanger, Chief Washington Correspondent of the New York Times. And on January 28th, we'll have a program on U.S. national security implications of cyber attacks. And in light of everything that's going on with Google and China, we think it's particularly timely and hope you come out for that. Please see the council staff or website for more information. I'd also like to bring your attention to audience response cards that are on your seat. On behalf of the Chicago Council, I'd like to thank you all for joining us this evening. Tonight, we welcome Reverend Jim Wallis to our Chicago Council platform. Many of you are probably familiar with Reverend Wallis's work and frequent writings on faith for Sojourners magazine and the Huffington Post. And I'm sure, like many of you, saw him last night on the Jon Stewart Show. It has been almost 1 year to the day since Reverend Wallis was in Davos at the World Economic Forum, challenging the audience of CEOs and heads of state with the question, how will this crisis change us? So we look forward to him answering that quest for us tonight, as well as his insights on a number of other topics. Reverend Wallis is the president and CEO of Sojourners, where he's also the editor-in-chief of Sojourners magazine. His recent books include The Great Awakening, Reviving Faith and Politics in a Post-Religious Right America, and God's Politics, Why the Right Gets It Wrong and the Left Doesn't Get It, both of which appeared on the New York Times bestseller list. An international commentator on religion and public life, faith, and politics, he is a frequent publisher of columns in major newspapers and regularly appears on radio and television. He is a graduate of Michigan State University. Leading the discussion with Reverend tonight is Eboo Patel. Dr. Patel is the founder and executive director of Interfaith Youth Corps, a Chicago-based institution building the global interfaith youth movement. He is the author of Acts of Faith, A Story of an American Muslim, The Struggle for the Soul of a Generation, which I'm sure many of you have read, but if you haven't, it's really a terrific read and I highly recommend it. A regular contributor to the Washington Post, National Public Radio, and CNN, Dr. Patel is a member of the President Obama's Advisory Council of the White House Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships, and is a board member of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. He's also a member of our forthcoming task force on religion and foreign policy, has played an active role of which we are truly, truly grateful. So please join me in welcoming Reverend Wallis and Dr. Patel.
Well, I get to be on stage with a lot of experts, and I get to be on stage with not that many heroes. Tonight is different. Jim Wallis has been a hero of mine for a good long time, and I wanted to open by just telling you how I first got to know Jim Wallis. About 15 years ago, when I was a college student, I found out about a woman named Dorothy Day, a woman whose belief in a sense of cosmic justice led her to live a life consistent with that. She founded something called the Catholic Worker Movement, houses of hospitality that brought together communities of people trying to live in a Christ-like way, which is to say simply and in solidarity with those who go without. And my mom is here tonight, and I still remember the conversation where I said to her, I think I'm going to take the summer after my sophomore year in college and go travel through Catholic worker houses of hospitality. It wasn't the internship she was expecting that summer. Nevertheless, I got the keys to the Oldsmobile and I went gallivanting up and down the eastern seaboard. And one of my questions wherever I went was, who is the Dorothy Day of this era? And the answer that I got from Atlanta to Boston was Jim Wallis. So, 19-year-old raggedy kid, I showed up at the Sojourners office in Washington, D.C. one sweltering July day in the summer of 1995, and I demanded to see Jim Wallis. And his assistant said, Jim is here for exactly 1 day this month, and this happens to be the day, but there's no way you can see him because he's just packed from 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. or 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. or whatever. So I wasn't that interested in taking no for an answer.
Yeah.
So I found out where Jim Wallis lived, and I went and sat on his stoop until he came home that night.
True.
And I got my conversation, and I got my first encounter with a figure who, in my mind, is not today's Dorothy Day, but today's Jim Wallis, and who a next generation of young people will say, I want to be the Jim Wallis of the mid-20th century, mid-21st century, the way that Jim Wallis was who he was in the late 20th and early 21st century. So it's powerful for me to be with you tonight, to go from the stoop to the stage. Thank you for coming to Chicago. And let me open with something that I've had the privilege of hearing you say a lot about your coming to consciousness during the civil rights movement. Tell us about that coming of age. Tell us about how that made you the Christian that you are, the preacher that you are, the American that you are. How did that happen?
For those of you that know Eboo, you'll be surprised at how persistent he was. Right? Stalked by Eboo Patel.
Right.
That was, I think he said, let's talk for 10 minutes, and we went longer. We've had lots of longer conversations since. Eboo, to me, is one of the bright spots on our horizon, so I'm very pleased. Again, we did this for your conference just a few months ago. I grew up in a Midwestern evangelical Christian home and family, and faith was the biggest thing in our lives. My parents started the church that we went to, and I often tell the story that I was saved at the age of 6 when my parents were worried. See, I was 6 and I hadn't been saved yet. I was getting up in years, and they were concerned. And so a revivalist came on Sunday night. I was sitting in the front row, and he was scary. He was fiery. He pointed his finger right at me, it felt like. He said, if Jesus came back tonight, your mommy and daddy would be taken to heaven, and you would be left all by yourself. Got my attention. I realized at 6 I'd have a 5-year-old sister to support. So I asked my mom how to fix this, and she told me, and not about God's wrath, but that God loved me and wanted me to be his child. I said, cool, I signed up. Repented of the sin and degradation in my first 6 years, which in my case was substantial. And then I got to be about 14 in Detroit still, and I began to listen to my city, and I was reading the papers and hearing the news, and I began to ask questions. How come we live the way we do in white Detroit, and life seems so different just a few miles or blocks away in Blackburn? At least that's what I was beginning to understand. They told me I was too young to ask those kind of questions. When I got older, I'd understand, or we don't know why it's that way, but it's always been that way. One honest answer was, if you keep asking that question, son, you're going to get into a lot of trouble, and that proved to be true. So I went into the city, and I began to walk the streets, and I began to find the black churches, and that was the beginning of everything else for me. And so I came home one day from those adventures, and a church elder one night, he said, Jim, you got to understand that Christianity has nothing to do with racism. That's political. And our faith is personal. And a 14-year-old kid, I think that's the night that I left, in my head and my heart, because the faith thing wasn't answering my questions. And I didn't have words to go around it then, but I do now. That God is personal, but never private. And so from then on, I've been trying to figure out the public meaning of faith in the world, and that's what drew us together as well. Now, my Dorothy Day story happened here in Chicago. She was just leaving as we were coming on the scene, so we were living in Chicago. I went to Trinity Seminary. We were living in Uptown. I get a call one day from a priest, and Dorothy Day's in town, opening a Catholic worker house on Kenmore up on the north side. She wants to meet you. Do you have time? Do I have time?
Right.
You know? We had one community car, was always broken. And so I ran, 20 blocks, and I'm in the parlor of the Catholic worker, and in walks the great lady. Dorothy wrote a book about her life called Love is the Measure, but she wasn't ever soft, very tough. So, you're a radical student like me, right? Yeah. You were a Marxist like me, right? Yeah. And now you're a Catholic. I said, well, I'm Christian. You're not a Catholic? And I said, some of my best friends are Catholic. But she was kind and called Sojourners the Protestant Catholic Worker, and from then on we became friends. So basically, it's how to put, our mission statement still is as how to put faith into action, articulating the biblical call to social justice. How do you put this thing called faith into action on the street, on the streets of our lives? How do we do that? That's what I've been doing for all these years.
Right, and it's, I mean, the theme of this book and the theme of tonight is how can our faith, how does our faith call us, and how does it guide us in engaging the crisis of the moment? And
Right.
the economic crisis being perhaps the paramount one. I want to just talk about your work after seminary, founding Sojourners. I've heard you describe it as doing the unfinished business of the civil rights movement. Talk about that a little bit.
You know, I spent too much of my time trying to change the impression of God that people get when they hear, well, Pat Robertson talk about why there was a earthquake in Haiti. You heard that, I'm sure. And I love the time when religion meant the animating core of the civil rights movement. So Martin Luther King Jr. was my mentor, every sermon, every speech. And, you know, to me, that's when we were at our best in the community of faith. When we animated a movement, I was just a young kid, 10-year-old kid, we animated the movement that really changed a nation. And we have a wonderful history of progressive religion, if you might say, abolition of slavery, women's suffrage, civil rights, time and time again. And it's that recent history of the religious right that is more the aberration than the norm. And so I really stand in a long tradition of a lot of men and women who really have understood their faith to be about changing their neighborhoods, their nation, and their world. And so for me, the civil rights movement was the paradigm, was the example, the mission that I just always aspired to.
And so a huge part of the civil rights movement's victories and gains were around race, were around ending segregation. Poverty is still desperately with us. And I remember you asking candidate Obama at the Compassion Forum in Pennsylvania, you know, if you become president, will you commit to putting America on the track to cut poverty in half over 10 years? And I was struck by the nuance. I was there with you that night. I was struck by the nuance in candidate Obama's answer, which is, A, we have to do that. And I remember him calling you Jim, because you guys are old friends. We have to do that, but it's going to be challenging. And I'm wondering, you've been working on this for 30 years. And the president has asked you this, not only in the context of the Faith Council that you and I serve on, but also personally because of your relationship with him and your role in this work. What are the most important strategies for cutting poverty in half in 10 years?
The other thing he said that night was, he said, yes, I will commit to that, but I won't be able to do it without your help, without a mobilization on all of our parts. And I think he didn't know then how right he was about that at the time. Mm-hmm. And I think it was early on that his team, after their polling, decided that poverty wasn't going to be a successful political strategy in their first year. And it's interesting how there are reasons not to focus on poverty in bad times. And then when the times become better, there are new reasons why not to focus on poverty. There's a lot that I could say about the components of a strategy that would be metrics for success. And they have to do with things like big ticket items like jobs and healthcare and housing and all the rest. But at the core, poverty won't change until we do. Finally, you take responsibility for changing things that you feel deeply connected to. As long as poverty is out there and about somebody else and not about people that we have dinner with and whose kids our kids play with and whose lives we know, it's just too distant. And I think this crisis gives us lots of opportunities for a lot of rethinking. And one possibility is it could create a kind of empathy, a kind of connection, and even a kind of solidarity we haven't had for a long time. Because now the poor are in our congregations, in our pews, in our families, and closer relationships. And I think, it's not going to happen. Let me put it this way. When he won the election, he said in one of his first speeches, he said, "I'm going to need the wind of a movement at my back to accomplish anything significant." So I had his email back then. So I wrote him and said, "Yeah, and one at your front as well, to clear the path and to pull you along when necessary, because presidents always need that." A political movement elected Barack Obama. It is yet to become a social movement to accomplish any of the things that he promised and campaigned on. And I think this past week indicates that even more. History tells us that electing the new person, the right person, the best person, where our hopes and dreams are, is not what leads to change. What leads to change are social movements that change the context in which politics takes place and allows even good political leaders to do something right. So back to King for a minute. When King came back from winning the Nobel Peace Prize, he didn't even go to Atlanta, he went to Washington to see Johnson. He didn't even go home first. And we had just won the Civil Rights Bill, which is why he got the Nobel. So here's the nation's moral leader saying to the nation's political leader, the master of realpolitik, Lyndon Johnson, "Mr. President, we need a Voting Rights Act now, because until we can vote in the South, we can't even enforce the Civil Rights Act." And King said, "I'm sorry, Dr. King, I wish I could do that, but I've cashed in all my chits with the Southern senators to get the Civil Rights Bill passed. I've got no political capital left. It'll be 5 or 10 years before I can get you a Voting Rights Act. But we can't wait that long. We need that." "Well, I'm sorry, Dr. King, I just can't do it. It's not politically possible. I can't do it." King wasn't one to whine or withdraw or complain or quit. Instead, he organized a campaign in a sleepy town in Alabama nobody had heard of called Selma. And John Lewis, a young activist, now member of Congress, and a ragtag group of SNCC workers got beaten almost to death on the Edmund Pettus Bridge on that bloody Sunday. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel comes down from Boston, and clergy turn out like never before, and they march from Selma to Montgomery, and the whole nation focused on that, and in 5 months, we had a Voting Rights Act. Not 5 years, not 10 years, 5 months. So Doris Kearns Goodwin and I were on a panel one day about presidential leadership, And she said, and Lyndon Johnson went to a joint session of Congress and called for a Voting Rights Act. I said, Doris. Bless his heart, I'm glad he did. But King changed the wind. You know, wet-fingered politicians in D.C., they walk around like this. You can tell who's around Capitol Hill. Suits and ties and fingers in the air. And it's amazing how fast they change when the wind changes. So our job, what I learned from King, is our job is to change the wind. And so you look for moments when the wind could change. And I think all the people who had a lot of hope are not being hopeful tonight. But I think, let's put it this way. A year ago, people voted for change. This week, they voted for change again. And they want to change Washington and Wall Street and the relation between the two. And until some political leaders change any of that, they'll keep voting against who's ever there. Because people really do want change.
And change is the subject of this book, and I want to get into it. There are, 3 people in the world whose books I buy in the day they come out. You're one of them. I love this. I love The Great Awakening. I love God's Politics. One of the things I love about this book is the immediate paradigm shift you do at the beginning. You tell the story of being at Davos a year ago, and the question being, when will the economic crisis end? And all these great, prognosticators saying on October 2010, we'll be back at 12,000 in the Dow or whatever. And you stayed up and say, wait a second, wrong question. How is the crisis going to change us? First of all, how did that go over at Davos?
I was surprised to be asked to speak on the topic of values and the market. Now, Davos is always has a social conscience sidebar, an extracurricular activity early one morning on the 4th floor. Jim Wallis, Muhammad Yunus, and 40 people get up early and come. This time it was in the main hall in plenary prime time. Tony Blair was on the panel with me. The next day he said, man, they must be in crisis to have a panel on values in the market and invite you to speak. So I had all these CEOs and heads of state, not my usual crowd. And I said, every morning we turn on CNN, and there's one of you being interviewed by the same reporter, always cashmere scarves. The magic mountain Davos, snow falling in the back. It's very picturesque. And he always asks the same question, when will the crisis end? And they have a whiteboard and they make predictions. I said, with all due respect, it's the wrong question. Question is, how will the crisis change us? Adam Smith talked about the market as an invisible hand. So I held my hand up. What do you do when the invisible hand lets go of the common good and all of our values? Adam Smith wrote in an earlier book called The Moral Sentiments, without a moral framework, says Adam Smith, without ethical sensibility, the market can't work, it can't function, and it ends up devouring the other sectors and then finally devouring itself. I talked about 2 of Gandhi's deadly social sins, which are wealth without work, commerce without morality. And for 3 days, I was having these pastoral, confessional conversations with a lot of CEOs. What were those Gandhi's 7 deadly sins again? And I'm going back next week. And since then, Davos is really wrestling with this question. So they have now a whole sort of curriculum at this time on values. And Muhammad Yunus and I are going to be on the panel this time in the main session, not on the 4th floor upstairs. And I did a video from McKinsey last week on values. So I don't know where this is going, but I'm feeling Wall Street and Main Street and our streets and the back streets are ready for a conversation. Now, I've been talking a lot about the bonuses because that's what's in the news cycle, and that's what Jon Stewart was excited about last night. And so I pointed out that $150 billion in bonuses, 6 banks, could erase the budget gap of all 50 states, provide health care for 2/3 of the uninsured 31 million people, unemployment insurance extension for 7 months for 16 million people. Quarter of that could resolve, prevent, postpone foreclosures to 2012. That's what we're talking about here. But I want to say the bonuses are the symptom of the problem, because underneath this economic crisis is a values crisis, and we won't get to an economic recovery without a moral recovery. And underneath the bonuses, you've got an erosion of societal values. And there's new maxims that greed is good. It's all about me, and I want it now. Counter to those, like we were talking before, are religious traditions. Religion has no monopoly on morality, just so you know that I think that. But our traditions have some correctives here, like greed is good. No, enough is enough. It's all about me. No, we're in this together. I want it now. No, the Native American ethic is to evaluate decisions today by their impact on the 7th generation out. That's an antidote to our short-termism. So I'm finding a lot of business people in New York last week and today, they're coming like Nicodemus at night to have these kind of private conversations. And then a lot of community organizers and a lot of people who are being foreclosed upon. And so this could be a chance for a real conversation about values. It's a structural crisis that needs structural change. It's a spiritual crisis that needs change in all of our lives. So I think crisis presents us with that kind of opportunity. It's dangerous and it's painful. We began the book tour in Detroit, my hometown. One of 2 workers there is looking for a job in my hometown. But the only way to redeem that suffering is to be changed by it. So in Davos, they're doing it again. And we're going to have a serious conversation. And I'm not sure what will come of it, but we're going to have it again. And so far, it's what they're wanting to talk about.
Let me put you on 2 stages. Let me put you on a stage, next week's stage at Davos. Premise is going to be, we need a change in values. You are the business leaders of the world. Here is what you can do to help bring about a change in values. Give us a preview of that.
You know, the 2 times in our history here where we've reached the peak of the great gaps between the top and the bottom, CEO, salaries, average workers, 2 high points to those gap times. The year before the Great Depression and the year before this Great Recession. Those 2 times. There's a chapter in the book about when the gaps become too big. 30 years ago, it was like 30-1 CEO salaries to average workers. Just 30 years ago, now it's 415-1. And last night, Jon Stewart, he's been on this topic for a while now. In fact, the first chapter in the book is Sunday School with Jon Stewart. Because when he had Jim Cramer on, remember that one?
And went after him, yeah.
Yeah, and he had Jim Cramer on, and he really took him to task in a way that nobody really has about, you know, is this a game? This is a casino economy. They're taking real people's money. Do we think that wealth is disconnected from work? And I was preaching in the National Cathedral that Sunday, happenstance, and the text was Jesus overturning the money changers' temple, in the temple. And I said, I just thought, that's what I watched on TV. I watched Stewart enacting that modern parable with Jim Cramer. So the sermon, I told John last night, the sermon was in the National Cathedral, Sunday School with Jon Stewart. And so as a comedian, he just kind of laid bare this scandal and shame, he called it. I said, it's also the bonuses and the gaps. I think it's a sin of biblical proportions, which he liked. But I think it is that. And I'm Klaus Schwab, who is the head of the World Economic Forum. He's as secular a Swiss business guy as I know, economist. Look at his op-ed in the Wall Street Journal in the last week. Klaus says, when business loses sight of the whole notion of social contract, social covenant, the common good, communitarian value. This is Klaus Schwab. This isn't Jim Wallis, right? We are in danger of social unraveling, of social erosion, social spinning out of control here. And I think the smart people there realize how serious this really is. Mm-hmm. And so I want to say, are we willing to take responsibility again for the common good? Do we have multiple stakeholders like workers, consumers, the environment, the seventh generation out, or is it really just shareholders in a quarterly profit and loss statement? Is that really a sustainable model for economics? And so I'm hoping that this conversation, that people like Klaus can take it to a different level here. They have this for the first time. Jack DeJoy, Georgetown, and I are chairing this, the first ever faith council at Davos. So we had a pre-council meeting, and all these councils met in Dubai, and it was like the council on branding, marketing, sustainability, and faith. And at one point he said, go visit another council. So Jack and I are sitting there, and people are peeking around our curtain, you know, what's going on in the faith council, you know? Can I come in? We'll take an offering of an altar call. I said, we're doing snake handling at 3 o'clock.
Right.
So it's a whole funny thing going on. But I think if we don't reset our values, we're going to have the cycle of boom and bust all over again. Mm-hmm. And in boom and bust, you know, the people who have the money, what they literally did this time is they took money, our money, went to Las Vegas, put it on Red 21, and if they win, they get richer. If they don't, we'll bail them out. The contradiction, and that Klaus points this out in the Wall Street Journal, those who caused the crisis are the ones that we have bailed out. And those who did least to cause it, but are the ones from it, are on their own. So I'm on the Treasury steps in Washington, D.C. PICO organized a press conference for folks being foreclosed, African American, Latino homeowners, first-time homeowners, and they're being foreclosed on. And some of them qualified for fixed-rate mortgages, but they got tricked in the time-bomb mortgages, and now they lost their jobs. And the woman before me, before I spoke as the religious leader, she just started crying. Here's the White House. They're meeting, Obama's meeting with the bankers while we're there. Here's Bank of America, here's Treasury. And I just thought, you know, we're afraid of a meltdown, so we extended grace to Bank of America down here. And they extended no grace to anybody else. So I said in John's Drew last night, join me, my wife and I, we fired Bank of America. We took our money out of our little neighborhood branch bank. And I said last night, they say they're too big to fail. I say make them smaller, you know. So I think we could build a citizen movement around this crisis that would finally be the wind clearing the way and pulling even the best politicians along. Left to their own devices, I think they're going to always decide that issues like poverty are just not politically viable.
I want to ask you one last question, but before I do that, I just want to take a moment to remember your colleague and co-author, Tim King, who is suffering right now in the hospital. He's a good friend of ours. He's a deeply beloved colleague of yours. He's a graduate of North Park University. My prayers, our prayers are with him. I just want to take that moment.
He helped me write the book. He's got an epilogue in the book. So it's the notes from a new generation.
Yeah. A remarkable young man.
Yeah, he is.
I had the honor to speak at Montreat a couple weeks ago. Montreat is where Billy Graham lives, and I had the chance to be on stage in front of 850 Protestant college students. And afterwards, at my book signing, a young woman came by and said, Jim Wallis blurbed your book. He's in the back of your book. And I said, yeah. She said, I'm a Christian because of Jim Wallis. I thought to myself, that's about the highest compliment imagine you can get. And I wanted to just end my part of this before bringing Rachel on and asking her to facilitate the Q&A. Talk about faith as a force of connection between those who have, those who go without, faith as a force of connection within congregations, faith as a force of connection between different religious communities, which is the work we do at the Interfaith Youth Corps.
I like what Bono says when he's asked, are you a practicing Christian? He says, yeah, I keep practicing, and someday I hope to, be one. Or like what Gandhi said about, in Dorothy Day's Neighborhood, big billboard reporter, Gandhi, Mr. Gandhi, what do you think of Western civilization? Gandhi, I think it would be a good idea. I was amazed, Eboo, in the research for this book and going through our various traditions, Judaism, Islam, Christianity, how a lot of the correctives to this crisis are embedded in our traditions. And that's where it could be a real connector here. It's not about being sectarian, it's about what does your tradition have to offer that could help us now. Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, don't be anxious for what you eat, drink, and put on. Modern advertising says, be anxious all the time. Worry, 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 Judaism talks about always leave the edges of the field for gleaning for the poor so they can take care of themselves. It talks about the Jubilee tradition, this regular leveling of things. Well, that's all in the heart of Judaism. And I actually began to talk to some people, Islamic bankers, about Sharia banking. Interesting. Can't do usury. Christianity used to not do usury either a long time ago. There's some interesting models there. So how do we take the learnings? What if we had adult Sunday school classes in our congregations on economics and our faith? What does the Bible say, Quran say? What does it say? How do you have a Christian, Jewish, or Islamic response to this crisis? And then what are the other, like the common good is not just a religious tradition, it's a part of our democratic heritage. So I think, at Barack's inauguration, they sang the Shaker hymn, "'Tis a gift to be simple, gift to be free." Values of simplicity, stewardship, patience, humility are in our traditions, and they're exactly the correctives we need right now. So I talk about changing our habits of the heart. There's a lot of talk about, in our council with Obama, a lot of talk about a clean energy economy. Well and good, but you can't just rewire the energy grid for that. You got to rewire us for that. Habits, expectations, assumptions, demands. In this chapter, I Want It Now, one of my favorite parts, Tim found me this. A late night comedian is doing a routine, and he says, "Some on this airplane," and this flight attendant says, "We've got wireless internet now in the air while you fly." And the crowd cheers, and she says, "But it's broken today." And the guy next to me says, "This is bull, bull, bull." He's mad about something he didn't know existed 10 seconds ago. So I think in contrast to that, if you start to remember, what are the things we learned going to bed at night with the stories our parents were reading to us? I'm a Little League baseball coach. My 6-year-old, 11-year-old, all my Little League stories are here, my best Little League stories. Little League teaches you stuff that help to
That the rest of life helps you unlearn, actually.
You should have been on my team. It was a great team. Anyway, I think it could be a connector in the sense that how do you Eboo, tell us what Islamic tradition would have to say about this crisis. Tell us, David Saperstein called me this afternoon, a good friend of ours. David, as a rabbi, what does Judaism really say about a crisis like this? How do we have a religious, non-sectarian, a religious sort of each draw from our own wells and have this conversation? So I think it could be a great connector here. And I also think that our congregations could be very interesting places where that conversation takes place and new models are tried. In Detroit, my hometown, the chapter is called The Parable of Detroit, The Green Shoots of Hope. Because in Detroit, it may be that in Michigan and Ohio, where there's nothing left but hope, all the new stuff breaks out. So the Capuchin Fathers in Detroit have given away hundreds of thousands of plants, and they've seeded this urban gardening movement all over Motown. I mean, family plots on squatted land, abandoned lots, chickens, geese, ducks, goats, sheep, even cows are grazing in the inner city of Detroit. Artists are coming back and buying up houses. So a pastor I know in Columbus, Ohio, calls one day and says, biggest church in Ohio, but unemployed people. He says, I think we're going to have an offering on Palm Sunday for unemployed people. We want to help in this town. I think we're going to raise $250,000. I said, Rich, that's a lot of money for one offering. He says, yeah, but I just think God's calling us to this. They raised in one offering $635,000, which they've created a whole employment network and center, not just for their church, but the whole city of Columbus. So how do you do mutual aid? A lot of congregations are big enough to do forms of credit unions. How do you do help with hunger, jobs, housing? There could be all kinds of new, so moving that money is a good idea to local banks and credit unions that really are serving the community. So we could be a place of conversation and a place of new models and new ideas and a place that really calls, on Morning Joe this morning, it's amazing how whenever people are mad about what's happening to them economically, somebody says, be careful about class warfare. I love that. So somebody makes war on all the rest of us, and then if we get mad, we're the ones that are causing the class warfare. Risky, I've had Wall Street people come quietly, privately and say, the only growth we got is leverage. It's just a casino gambling economy. We risked all of the money of all these people, and they made sure we're okay. I think, people are mad about that, and it's time for some public accountability. And I think there could be a mass movement around that, but only if, what I'd like to see Barack Obama do is, and I'll quit with this, is he was converted in a black church, and he knows black preaching. So some of you know what I'm talking about. I'd like to see the political equivalent of call and response in the black church. Call and response. Political leadership calling for a movement to make the change. Call for it, but if you don't call for it, or maybe it should start with us. We respond, and then he calls for it. So that's what I think is possible.
Right. Pushing on open doors, as you say. Thank you, Jim. We're going to go to audience questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we have, as you know, roving mics. So I will raise your hand if you have a question. I'll call on you. Please wait for the mic, and please end your question with a question mark. We'll go right over there.
Jim and Eboo, Don Ziegler's my name. I've been a follower of Jim and his writings, and I would be encouraged, but I'm really disturbed. I'm in the middle of a book about another movement of evangelicals that are doing exactly the opposite. And the book is called The Family. And it's the elite fundamentalism that is leading our society. There's a big difference between what you're about and what they're about. Could you describe the difference?
You know, I'm familiar with the book, and this is another sort of a critique on the religious right. My experience of the religious right now is they're like these old guys standing in the middle of a river, and the water's now about up to their chin, and it's rushing past them. And the water is a whole new generation rushing past them. In all our traditions, they were at your conference. And these folks are saying, whoa, 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 wait. Like they're saying, there are only two moral values issues, you know. And a whole generation saying, I'm sorry, I've left that room, I'm gone. So I don't spend any of my time anymore banging my head against closed doors, because there are so many open doors out there. We don't have time to walk through all the open doors that are being offered now. So, and even behind the closed doors, I know that movement that the author is referring to. There's actually some contradictions in that book, but there are in that movement that he's talking about young people that have now come to us from that same movement. So I have these conversations with half the crowds, wherever we go now, half the crowds are under 30, and half of them under 25, and they're not going there. They're going where he was going. They're not going there. So I'm actually hopeful about that. I'm not hopeful about Washington right now, but I'm hopeful about what's happening in the country in a lot of places.
Right there. Back. Oh, I'll come back to you, sorry.
Thank you. Reverend Wallis, you're a very inspiring man. Thank you so much for coming to talk with us. Through my work, I have experience with a lot of very large firms. I work with a lot of multi-billion-dollar companies, and one of the things that helps me when I talk with them is to have a model. And in terms of your experience and how you view corporations, what's a good model of moral behavior, or the type of behavior you would expect executives or senior staff in a firm to exemplify?
I was at the Drucker Business School Forum in LA last week, and I'd never been there before. And you know, Peter Drucker was quite a visionary business leader himself, and really before any of this crisis, he talked about that. He talked about, and Klaus Schwab in his Wall Street Journal piece, which you should see, talked about the corporation, he said, as a purposeful organization, more than just a profitable organization. What are the purposes of this organization? What are we producing that adds to the common good? And again, this is Peter Drucker, Klaus Schwab. These aren't, you know, Eboo and I are, you know, everyone knows we're active. We're social justice activists. I mean, people expect us to talk this way. But, you know, I'm hearing people in corporations saying, I'm tired of, I was on a conference call last week with this panel in Davos, and these were all CEOs except for me and Mohammed Yunus, and they talked about the problem of short-termism, one of them called it. short-termism. Finally, it's not good for an economy, even for that business. They talked about the breakdown, the destruction of trust. Nobody trusts us anymore. How can you be successful when you've lost trust? They talked about responsibility. We're not taking personal responsibility as business leaders. And finally, when I talked about the common good, they all said that's what we should be accountable to. So, you know, again, this isn't my field, this isn't my territory, but I'm having these conversations. And I hear people within those places doing that. On the other hand, the people who, I talked to somebody, Goldman, last week, a young person, and she resonates, but she said, but in the environment I'm in, all that people want to do is make money. And they're spending $300 million right now, Wall Street's spending that much money to keep themselves from being regulated, to stop there being a consumer financial protection agency. They're trying to stop that from happening. To do that a year after what they have done is shameless. But institutionally, they're doing that, but I'm saying even within those institutions, there are people who are saying, I'm not comfortable with all of this. So to me, we need a new generation of business leaders. I was telling you before, at Davos, the social entrepreneur sector now, which I'm going to talk to next week, is both nonprofit and profit. The walls are kind of permeable, but they're all social entrepreneurs who are trying to do new and different kind of things, and some are on the private side, some are on the nonprofit side. But to me, this just can't come from religion or activism or education. It's got to come from the business side and the nonprofit side, both, I think.
Right here.
W. Bush is an evangelical Christian. I have no reason to doubt that. And our current president is a Christian. What, in your view, what accounts for the political differences between them, or are there great political differences between them?
One of the earliest conversations I had with Barack Obama when he was a state senator from Illinois was he'd become a Christian, but he was, you might say, a progressive Christian like I was, and we were trying to figure out why our interpretation seemed so different than a lot of other people's, you know. And there's lots of ways to explain that, but part of it is Stokely Carmichael used to say in the civil rights movement, what you see, your perspective is shaped by what you see when you get out of bed in the morning. Location, context. You put evangelical Christians, like Nick Kristof, my favorite New York Times columnist. Nick writes about the forgotten people and forgotten places in the world like nobody else. He's not particularly a religious person, but wherever he goes to those people and places, who he finds there with those people are evangelical Christians and Catholic women and very religious people. And you put those kind of fervent people right with suffering people, it changes them. You know, this new generation, the reason they're different is they're a globalized generation. They have, what changed me was going to places I wasn't supposed to ever be, meeting people I was never supposed to ever meet, where the signs scream at you, no trespass. You know, when you're interrogated by the South African security police, I wasn't supposed to ever have that experience. The first time they put you in jail and lock the door, and you're on the wrong side of the law as a white, middle-class, Midwestern Christian, all of a sudden, I've seen a lot of people, I've taken a lot of people to jail, and I see a lot of them cry the first time they're locked up because I was never supposed to be here. So what changes us is not all these rational belief systems, it's really our experience in the world, what we taste and touch and smell and see, and what really finally grips our hearts. So, Barack Obama was a community organizer before he ever got converted, and so he was in a whole different context, and he came to faith through all of that. But I think what's changing people now is really their experience. It's that's why the Robertson thing so offended me, because anything about God that I believe, that God is with those who suffer. Elie Wiesel once said, there was a man being hung, and so I said, "Where's God in that?" He said, "At the end of the rope." So God is with those who suffer. That's what I believe. That's where I think God is. And to say that God is somehow above it all, or God caused this, or it was because of a pact with the devil, or because people do voodoo, I mean, this gives God a bad name, So I think, to me, the differences are often less theological and more contextual.
Reverend, I was on that point, I was having a conversation with a head of a leading U.S. refugee organization, and he was focused on finding homes for refugees coming to the U.S. And he was new to this position, and he was shocked to find the receptivity of housing refugees particularly high in Utah. And actually, what surprised him, he's a religious man himself, but it was because you have a high percentage of those who are doing missionary work.
Yeah.
And an interesting understanding of what the world looked like made them more receptive to housing refugees. So I thought, to that point of experience, it was very resonant with his experience. Howard, right here, and then we'll come to the back again.
I'm curious what you think are the 3 or 4 most important questions to get people thinking and talking about, to activate a social movement that really recalibrates our values.
Yeah, this Susan Thistlewaite is here somewhere tonight too. We were talking on the way in about that after a week like this, we all need a little bit of hope about social movements again. You and I have talked about this in the past too. I think that should be our discussion. I spoke to the independent sector, which is a group of nonprofit organizations and foundations, philanthropy in Detroit, a couple months back, and I think I surprised them by saying, Washington is wired to block change. If we didn't know that before, we should know it now. So how do we wire ourselves to build movements? Because in the, as you know well, in the sort of philanthropic or society, there still is an awful lot of silo thinking and turf and territory and competition for scarce resources and media space and all the rest. And I still don't think that we think movement. I think we yearn for it. But how do you really concretely do what you're, I mean, I don't know what those 4 things are, but we should figure out what those, for example, it's building alliances, strategic partnerships, relationships, and I think it means aiming at some goals that are manageable and winnable and symbolic and are kind of game-changing, mindset-changing, perception-changing victories that could turn people's understandings around. So what's a transformational politics versus a purely incremental politics? Read, as you have read, Martin King's letter from a Birmingham jail. It's a critique of incrementalism, but it's based on transformational political thinking. So those of us who care about this have got to not just keep talking about movement, but have got to sit down with that question and say, okay, cross-sector, interfaith, what are 2 or 3 or 4 priorities that we're going to do together? I think that really is the next step. We can't just say, I don't think you could have found, we knew Barack Obama 10 years ago, I don't think we could have found a more, sort of transformational, charismatic, new generation, produced candidate like him. And yet here we are. So, and what happened was he got in there and said, let's see how he performs. And not, how are we going to perform? That's a whole different question. And if we didn't get that straight a year ago, we better get it straight now.
Let's go all the way in the back, in the middle there. Yeah, Elizabeth, by you right there. Great.
So, Jim, rich young ruler. The rich young ruler asked Jesus how to be saved, and he says, give all you have to the poor. If Wall Street gave the bonuses to fix this problem, game changer, it would rebuild trust. It would have completely overturned the conversation, but they will not. The difference, I think, between the civil rights movement and now is Karl Rove. We have people actively creating fake grassroots movements that marshal what William Jennings Bryan was using to deal with the same kinds of economic questions. Yeah. And there was a real populism. But now we have a fake populism siphoning off people's genuine fear and pain and anxiety. And so, what do we do with that?
Always count on Susan to focus the question here. First of all, rich young ruler. Richard Stearns, the head of World Vision, friend of ours, was with Lennox China when World Vision picked him to be their new CEO. And I didn't know Rich Stearns. I knew Lennox China. I had other candidates I would have preferred. But then I watched what happened to Richard Stearns. He's in Haiti tonight. And Rich has got a book out called The Hole in the Gospel. It's his own story. I call Rich the rich young ruler who didn't turn away. And so he's gone all over the world, and he's been just transformed. He's still by what he sees right now today in Haiti, what he saw for the first time in sub-Saharan Africa. So I think, it's the turning away or not turning away that is the key to that story. In that story, the rich young ruler turned away. Not turning away is in fact the way to salvation. But Susan raised a very good point. How did Scott Brown, I don't want to be partisan here, but how did the Tea Party movement become the populist movement? How did, the stage is set for populism. It is set for populism. So how did the populism of the right become the grassroots movement? There's a lot to unpack there. Part of it is good strategy, and they own media companies, and they own networks, and I'm not thinking of anybody in particular, but also, Susan, I think, we have to look at the progressive side, for a year or so, has kind of said, well, kind of the best they can do is okay with us. Best they can do is okay with us. And so one side is organizing, and one side's apologizing. And the ones who are organizing are getting the crowds and the media and the attention. And their message, as Susan is suggesting, if you look at it, it's really very flimsy. Today, one of the people I was on with this TV show with She's a financial person for MSNBC. She was saying, what is beating up the banks got to do with job creation? You know, and we says, yeah. Well, kind of everything, because the banks were given money so they would what? So they would lend to small businesses and to homeowners. They didn't do it. Goldman took the money and bet it in Vegas on Wall Street. And they paid the money back after they, at the market low, they used our money to climb back up the market that they brought down, and they made a fortune, and they're paying bonuses, and they never lend to small. So the conservative folks who say about jobs, small business create the most jobs. Yes, and they can't get loans. They can't get the loans to create jobs. So there's a direct correlation to the behavior of Wall Street and why we're not having jobs. And that's just an economic fact, and yet we can't get that conversation going in the media. So the target of the Tea Party stuff is government and not Wall Street. So there's Susan, there's an amazing kind of thing going on where the populist movement is an energy from the right, and on the left or progressive side, you know, our side really, and I'm caricaturing a bit, but our side really isn't doing the organizing and the mobilizing, but doing a lot of, and I think, let me say, part of it is, I think there always is a lot of danger to political access. In Washington, D.C., access is its own reward, its own purpose. Washington, D.C., what you want to do is you want to get the calls. You want to get the callbacks. You want to be in the room. You want to be in the meeting. You want to feel like you've got access. And for most people, that's enough. Left or right, it's enough just to have access. And they don't ask, we don't ask, to what end? What's the access for? What's the purpose of a different set of people being on White House conference calls and having access and getting your messages returned and getting meetings in the Roosevelt Room? I'm not against that, but King understood that you can navigate the corridors of power, but your base has to be outside of them. Your base has to be in a movement, and you have to navigate. But the outside-inside dynamic, we haven't figured out yet. So people are in the wilderness on the outside, and then they kind of get on the inside, or they know people on the inside, or they feel close to the inside, and all of a sudden we lose the outside-inside, that prophetic, that critique, that why are we having the access? What's it for? So, Susan, I think that the people who have the agenda for change have got to think about more than just the access they hope to have or think they have or have, and think about what it means to build movements. As Lincoln needed Frederick Douglass, Johnson and Kennedy needed Martin King. FDR needed a robust labor movement that made him do the New Deal. So how do we talk about that kind of movement? And I think Barack is an open door, but I think there's got to be a movement knocking on the door. And I don't think we've done that in this first year. That's a bit provocative, but that's what I think.
Well, and that's where we're going to leave it. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking both Reverend Wallis and Eboo, and his books are...